I almost lost everything because I wouldn't keep my mouth shut. I was 23 years old, standing in the print shop I'd worked years to build, watching my business partner walk out the door for the last time. Samuel Keimer, the man I'd trusted, the man I'd helped, looked at me with something worse than anger. It was a pity. And as that door closed, I realized the bitter truth. I had been so obsessed with being right, so desperate to prove I was the smartest person in every room, that I'd driven away the one relationship that mattered most to my survival. That night, I sat alone with my press, my tools, my ambition, and I understood something that would change everything. The words we speak to ourselves. The silent conversations happening inside our skulls every single morning, they aren't just thoughts. They're the architects of our entire reality. They build the rooms we live in. They construct the prisons we can't escape. So I made a decision that seemed crazy at the time. I would rebuild myself, sentence by sentence, word by word, morning by morning. I would speak to myself differently, and in doing so, I would become someone completely new. What I discovered in that process, what I'm about to share with you right now, isn't just advice. It's the operating system I used to transform from an arrogant, broke, alienated young man into someone who could build lasting friendships, create wealth, influence nations, and yes, find something resembling peace. But here's what matters to you. It started with 5 simple phrases I spoke to myself every single morning. Not affirmations, not wishful thinking, something far more powerful. And before you dismiss this as another self-help trick, let me be clear. I was a skeptic. I was a scientist. I didn't believe in magic or miracles. I believed in observation, experimentation, and results. What I'm sharing with you worked then, and it works now, because it's based on something deeper than positive thinking. It's based on how the human mind actually works, how character is actually formed, and how we actually become the person we're terrified we'll never be. You're here because something inside you knows you're capable of more. You feel it, don't you? That gap between who you are and who you could be. That frustration when you sabotage yourself, when you speak to yourself in ways you'd never speak to another human being, when you wake up and immediately begin the same internal conversation that's kept you stuck for years. I'm going to show you how to change that conversation. And when you change that conversation, everything else changes too. But first, you need to understand why this matters more than almost anything else you'll learn in your entire life. The words you speak to yourself in those first moments of consciousness don't just affect your mood. They literally rewire your brain. They determine what you notice, what opportunities you see, what actions you take, and ultimately, what results you create. I know this because I lived it. I tested it. I refined it over decades. And I watched it transform not just my life, but the lives of countless others who were willing to try something that seemed almost too simple to work. So here's what we're going to do together. I'm going to take you back to that moment when I was broke and alone and desperate. I'm going to show you exactly what I discovered about the human mind, about language, about transformation. I'm going to share the 5 specific phrases that changed everything. And then I'm going to show you how to use them, not as magic words, but as tools for genuine, lasting change. This isn't going to be quick. Real transformation never is. But if you stay with me, if you really listen, I promise you this. You'll understand yourself in ways you never have before. You'll see why you've struggled, and you'll have a clear, practical path forward. The version of you that could exist, that wants to exist, is waiting on the other side of this conversation. Let's begin. You know what nobody tells you about failure? It's not dramatic. There's no orchestra playing, no moment of tragic clarity. Failure is quiet. It's sitting in a room you can barely afford, eating bread you baked yourself because you can't buy any, realizing that every choice you've made has led you to this exact moment of absolute uncertainty. That was me in Philadelphia, 1723. I'd run away from Boston, burned bridges with my brother, gotten a girl pregnant in London and abandoned her, betrayed my friend's trust, and convinced myself the whole time that I was the hero of my own story. Because I was smart, you see. I could out-argue anyone. I could prove my point, win the debate, and demonstrate my superiority. And I was completely alone. Here's what I began to notice in those desperate months. Every morning, I would wake up and immediately begin talking to myself. Not out loud, but in that internal voice we all have. And what I was saying was poison. You've ruined everything. You're too arrogant. Nobody will ever trust you again. You're not as smart as you think you are. You're going to fail. I didn't choose these thoughts. They just appeared, like the weather, and I believed them completely. I thought that internal voice was telling me the truth, that it was being realistic, that I was just facing facts. But then I started experimenting. Because that's what I did, even then. I experimented with everything. I'd already been experimenting with my diet, trying vegetarianism. I'd been experimenting with my schedule, with my work habits, with my social interactions. So I thought, what if I experiment with this internal conversation? What if I could change it deliberately? The first thing I tried was a simple contradiction. When my mind said, "You're going to fail," I'd say, "No, I'm going to succeed." But that didn't work. It felt fake. My mind knew I was lying to it. The negative thoughts just got louder, more insistent, like they were fighting back. So I tried something different. Instead of contradicting the negative thoughts, I started asking questions. When my mind said, "You've ruined everything," I'd ask, "Have I really ruined everything? Is that actually true? What's one thing that's still working?" And that's when something shifted. Because when you ask a question, your mind has to answer it. It has to look for evidence. And when I looked for evidence, I'd find little things. My hands still worked. I still had my printing skills. Someone had smiled at me yesterday. The sun had come up. Tiny things. But they were real. And they contradicted the absoluteness of my negative thoughts. This became my laboratory. My own mind became the experiment. And over months and years, through trial and error, through careful observation of what worked and what didn't, I developed something I've never seen anyone else teach quite this way. I discovered that there are 5 specific types of statements that, when spoken to yourself every morning, actually rebuild your mind from the inside out. Not affirmations. Not denials. Something more sophisticated. Statements that work with how your brain actually functions, that harness the power of language to reshape neural pathways, to change habitual thinking, to transform character itself. Now, I didn't know anything about neural pathways back then. We didn't have that language. But I knew cause and effect. I knew that when I spoke certain phrases to myself consistently, my behavior changed. My emotions changed. My results changed. And when I stopped speaking to them, I'd slide back into old patterns. So I kept refining these phrases, testing them, modifying them, until I found the 5 that had the most profound and consistent impact. Before I share them with you, you need to understand something crucial. These phrases work because they're based on 3 principles I discovered about human psychology, principles that are just as true now as they were 300 years ago. First principle: your mind believes what you repeat to it with emotion and consistency. Not what you say once, not what you wish, what you repeat. The thoughts you think most often become the beliefs you hold most deeply. This isn't mystical, it's mechanical. Repetition creates neural patterns. Patterns create automatic responses. Automatic responses create your character. Most people repeat negative patterns to themselves without even realizing it. I'm not good enough. I always mess things up. Nobody listens to me. I can't change. Thousands of repetitions over the years. Is it any wonder these become self-fulfilling prophecies? Second principle: questions are more powerful than statements. When you make a statement, your mind can reject it. But when you ask a question, your mind must answer it. It's compelled to search for evidence, to activate memories, to make connections. A well-crafted question can force your mind to find resources you didn't know you had, to see possibilities you couldn't see before. Third principle: identity precedes behavior. You don't act and then become, you become, and then you act. If you see yourself as lazy, you'll find evidence of your laziness everywhere and act accordingly. If you see yourself as disciplined, you'll find evidence of your discipline and act accordingly. Change your identity, and behavior follows naturally. These 3 principles are the foundation. The 5 phrases I'm about to share with you are built on this foundation. They use repetition, but not mindless repetition. They use questions that redirect your mind's search. And they reshape your identity by focusing on who you're becoming, not who you've been. Are you ready? I need you to really be ready. Because once you hear these phrases, you can't unhear them. You'll recognize immediately how different they are from what you've been telling yourself. And you'll have a choice. Dismiss them as too simple, or actually try them and see what happens. Let me tell you what happened when I first started using these phrases consistently. Within a week, I noticed I was less defensive in conversations. Within a month, I'd repaired a damaged relationship. Within a year, my business had doubled. Within 5 years, I was respected throughout Philadelphia. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe what we say to ourselves matters more than we've ever imagined. Here's the first phrase. What am I grateful for right now? Notice, it's not a statement. It's a question. And it's not abstract gratitude. It's specific. Right now. What am I grateful for right now? When I first started asking myself this every morning, my mind would resist. It would say, nothing. Everything is terrible. But I'd force myself to find something. The bed I slept in. The air I was breathing. The fact that I could see. Tiny things. But here's what happened. By asking this question first thing every morning, I was training my mind to search for what was working instead of what was broken. I was creating a neural pathway that looked for abundance instead of scarcity. And throughout the day, I'd start noticing more things to be grateful for. Not because my circumstances changed, but because my attention changed. Your attention is everything. Where your attention goes, your energy flows. Most people's attention is trained on problems, on what's missing, on what's wrong. Not because they're bad people, but because the human brain evolved to spot threats and problems. It's a survival mechanism. But in modern life, this mechanism often makes us miserable. By starting every day, asking what you're grateful for, you're retraining your attention. You're teaching your mind to look for resources instead of threats. And when you see more resources, you feel more resourceful. When you feel more resourceful, you take more action. When you take more action, you get better results. This one question, asked consistently, changed how I experienced reality. Not because reality changed, but because I changed what I was looking for in reality. The second phrase, who am I becoming today? Not who you want to be someday. Not who you wish you were. Who are you becoming today in the choices you're about to make? This question does something profound. It shifts your focus from outcomes to identity. Most people set goals based on what they want to have or achieve. I want to make money. I want to be successful. I want to be happy. But having and achieving are external. Identity is internal. And identity is what drives consistent behavior. When I started asking myself every morning who I was becoming, I had to confront the truth. Some days, I was becoming someone I didn't respect, someone who avoided difficult conversations, someone who chose comfort over growth, someone who betrayed his own values for temporary pleasure. Seeing this was painful, but it was necessary. Because once I saw clearly who I was becoming through my actual choices, I could change those choices. I started answering this question intentionally. Who am I becoming today? Today, I'm becoming someone who keeps his word. Today, I'm becoming someone who shows up even when it's hard. Today, I'm becoming someone who tells the truth, even when it costs me. And then I'd make choices throughout the day based on that identity. Not what I felt like doing, but what that person would do. The person I was becoming. This is how character is built. Not through dramatic transformations or sudden enlightenment. Through daily choices, aligned with a clearly defined identity. The third phrase. What would I do today if I were brave? Most of our problems, most of our stuckness, comes from fear. Fear of rejection. Fear of failure. Fear of looking foolish. Fear of conflict. Fear of the unknown. And this, fear that we'll look foolish if we're wrong. I've watched this fear paralyze the brightest minds I've ever known. Scientists who refuse to publish groundbreaking theories because they haven't achieved absolute certainty. Entrepreneurs who hold on to failing business models because admitting the pivot means admitting initial failure. Leaders who double down on bad decisions simply because reversing course might make them appear weak or indecisive. But here's what I learned. Printing that newspaper, week after week, year after year, being wrong publicly and correcting course openly, actually builds more trust than maintaining a facade of infallibility ever could. When I published something in the Pennsylvania Gazette, and later evidence proved me mistaken, I didn't hide it. I addressed it directly in the next edition. I was wrong about this matter. And here's what I've learned since. You know what happened? Readership increased. People trusted the paper more, not less. Because deep down, Everyone knows that anyone who claims they're never wrong is either lying or not trying anything difficult. The most dangerous person in any room isn't the one who's been wrong the most. It's the one who's so terrified of being wrong that they've stopped testing their assumptions altogether. They've calcified around their existing beliefs like coral around a shipwreck, becoming part of the wreckage rather than salvaging what's valuable and swimming to shore. I'm going to tell you something that might sting. If you haven't changed your mind about something significant in the past year, you're not thinking hard enough. You're not exposing yourself to challenging ideas. You're not growing. The world changes. Evidence accumulates. New information emerges. Clinging to old conclusions when new data arrives isn't integrity, it's stubbornness, masquerading as principle. And that brings us to perhaps the most insidious barrier of all, our addiction to being right, even when being right keeps us stuck. We've confused consistency with character, when sometimes the highest form of character is saying, I no longer believe what I once held to be true, and here's why. I've watched brilliant minds trap themselves in intellectual prisons of their own making, defending positions they've privately abandoned simply because they've become publicly known for holding them. The scholar who built a career on one theory, now presented with evidence that dismantles it, faces a terrible choice: evolution or reputation. Too often, reputation wins, and we all lose the progress that honesty would have brought. This addiction to being right creates what I call the fortress mentality. We stop seeking truth and start defending territory. Our beliefs become real estate we've invested in, and admitting error feels like foreclosure. But here's what that mentality costs us. Every moment spent defending an indefensible position is a moment stolen from discovering something actually true. I've made this mistake myself more times than I care to count. I once insisted that earthquakes were caused by air trapped in underground caverns. Seemed perfectly logical at the time. When evidence suggested otherwise, my first instinct wasn't curiosity. It was defense. I felt that tightness in my chest, that urgent need to explain away the contradictions. It took conscious effort to recognize that feeling for what it was: my ego, terrified of being wrong, masquerading as intellectual rigor. The breakthrough came when I reframed the question. Instead of asking, how can I prove I was right? I started asking, what if I was wrong, and what becomes possible if I admit it? Suddenly, being wrong wasn't a failure, it was a doorway. Because here's the truth nobody tells you. Being wrong is only painful if you're trying to be perfect. But if you're trying to be accurate, being wrong is just data. It's feedback. It's the universe saying, not quite, let me show you something better. Think about how children learn to walk. They fall constantly. But they don't fall once and think, well, I guess I'm not a walker. They don't develop an identity around their current level of ability. They just keep adjusting based on what works and what doesn't. Somewhere along the way to adulthood, we forget this. We start treating our ideas like fragile heirlooms instead of rough drafts. Think about the last time you had what you thought was a brilliant idea. Maybe it was a business concept, a creative project, or a solution to a problem at work. How long did you hold on to it before testing it? A week? A month? 6 months of planning and perfecting in your head? I'll tell you what I did. I tested everything immediately, often sloppily, usually imperfectly. When I wanted to know if lightning was electricity, I didn't spend years building the perfect experiment. I flew a kite in a thunderstorm like an absolute madman. Was it dangerous? Absolutely. Was it the smartest approach? Probably not. But it gave me an answer in one afternoon that I could have spent a lifetime theorizing about. Here's what most people miss. The cost of waiting is almost always higher than the cost of trying. Every day you spend perfecting your idea in isolation is a day you're not getting real feedback, real data, real learning. You're operating in a vacuum where your assumptions go unchallenged and your blind spots remain invisible. I see this pattern everywhere in modern life. Someone spends 2 years building a product in secret, refusing to show anyone until it's perfect. Then they launch to crickets because they built something nobody actually wanted. Meanwhile, the person who put up a rough website in a weekend and started talking to customers is already on version 12 of something people are begging to buy. The iteration method isn't just faster, it's fundamentally more intelligent. Because you're not trying to predict the future from your desk, you're letting reality teach you. You're having a conversation with the world instead of a monologue with yourself. And here's the really beautiful part. Every iteration makes you smarter, not just about your specific project, but about how things work in general. You start developing instincts. You begin to see patterns. You learn which kinds of changes move the needle and which ones don't matter at all. This is how mastery actually develops. Not through perfect execution, but through repetition with variation. Not through avoiding mistakes, but through making them faster and learning from them more efficiently. The people who change the world aren't the ones with the perfect plan. They're the ones who take imperfect action, learn, adjust, and repeat until something extraordinary emerges. I've observed this pattern throughout history. Take Thomas Edison. Everyone celebrates his invention of the light bulb, but they forget he tested over 1,000 different filament materials before finding one that worked. When a reporter asked him how it felt to fail 1,000 times, Edison replied, "I didn't fail 1,000 times. The light bulb was an invention with 1,000 steps." That's the mindset that separates the innovators from the dreamers. Or consider the Wright brothers. They weren't the richest, most educated, or best-funded inventors trying to achieve flight. Samuel Langley had government backing, prestigious credentials, and far more resources. Yet the Wrights succeeded where he failed. Why? Because they built a wind tunnel in their bicycle shop and ran thousands of small experiments. Every afternoon, they'd test a new wing design, document the results, and iterate. They embraced what I call deliberate experimentation, the systematic pursuit of knowledge through controlled failure. This is where most people stumble. They want the result without the process. They see the Wright brothers' 12 seconds at Kitty Hawk and think, genius moment, not realizing it was preceded by 3 years of daily failures, adjustments, and incremental improvements. Success looks sudden from the outside, but it's actually the culmination of countless invisible iterations. Here's what I learned from my own experiments with electricity. Nature doesn't reveal her secrets to those who ask politely. She reveals them to those who probe, test, and occasionally risk getting shocked. Every time I flew a kite in a thunderstorm, yes, it was dangerous. And no, I don't recommend it. I learned something new about electrical charge. Each experiment was built on the previous one. Each failure narrowed the possibilities. The modern world has made experimentation easier than ever. Yet people experiment less than they did in the 18th century. Why? Because the stakes feel higher. In my day, if a printing experiment failed, I lost some paper and ink. Today, if your startup fails, everyone on social media knows about it. But here's the paradox. The cost of individual experiments has actually plummeted. You can test a business idea with a simple website. You can learn a skill through free online resources. You can validate an assumption with a survey sent to 100 people. The gap between thought and action isn't bridged by money. It's bridged by courage. And here's what I've noticed about courage. It's not something you're born with in abundance. It's something you build, one small act at a time. Every time you take a step despite the fear, you're depositing into your courage account. Every time you wait for perfect conditions, you're making a withdrawal. I started the Philadelphia Fire Department, not because I had all the resources, but because I saw houses burning and families losing everything. I gathered a group of volunteers. We met in taverns. We organized bucket brigades. Was it perfect? Absolutely not. Did it save lives? Without question. The electricity experiments that made me famous? I was literally flying kites in thunderstorms with my son. The scientific establishment thought I was a provincial amateur. They had laboratories, prestigious positions, and royal funding. I had curiosity and a willingness to look foolish. That willingness to start with what I had: a kite, a key. A stormy afternoon led to discoveries that changed how humanity understands nature itself. You don't need permission to begin. You don't need credentials to care about something. You don't need a committee's approval to take the first step. I see people paralyzed by the need for validation. They want someone with authority to tell them their idea is good, their instinct is right, and their direction is sound. But here's the truth about validation: it comes after action, not before it. You earn validation by doing, by showing, by creating something that speaks for itself. When I proposed the idea of a lending library, the very first in America, people were skeptical. Books were expensive. Who would share them? How would you prevent theft? What about damage? The questions were endless. The doubts were abundant. I didn't wait to answer every objection. I didn't commission a feasibility study. I started with 50 subscribers and a small collection. We wrote simple rules. We trusted each other. We began That library still exists today, nearly 300 years later. It's called the Library Company of Philadelphia, and it sparked a movement that put books in the hands of ordinary people across an entire continent. All because we started before we were ready, before it was perfect, before every question had an answer. Now, you might be thinking, but Franklin, you were smart, you were talented, you had connections. That's why you could start before you were ready. Let me stop you right there. When I arrived in Philadelphia in 1723, I was 17 years old. I had exactly one Dutch dollar and one copper shilling in my pocket. I was exhausted from days of travel. I was so hungry. I bought 3 puffy rolls and walked down Market Street, eating one and carrying the other 2 under my arms like an absolute fool. My future wife saw me that day and laughed at the ridiculous sight I made. I had no connections, no reputation, no credentials. I was a runaway apprentice with a limited education and no prospects. What I did have was a willingness to start anyway. See, there's this myth we tell ourselves that successful people had some invisible advantage, some secret ingredient that made their early attempts less risky, less foolish, less vulnerable than ours would be. We look at their finished achievements and assume they must have felt confident, ready, prepared. They didn't. What separates people who achieve their goals from people who spend their lives preparing to achieve them is simply this: they started messy. They started with gaps in their knowledge. They started with imperfect plans. They started before they felt ready, before they had permission, before the conditions were ideal. Think about it. Every person you admire was once a complete nobody standing at the same starting line where you're standing now. The only difference is that they crossed it. I started a newspaper before I fully understood the printing business. I conducted electrical experiments before anyone considered me a scientist. I proposed the Albany Plan of Union before I had any official diplomatic standing. I helped draft the Declaration of Independence before I was certain how the revolution would end. Every single meaningful thing I accomplished began with an uncomfortable, imperfect, uncertain first step. And here's what nobody tells you: that discomfort never completely goes away. Even now, looking back across 8 decades of life, I can tell you that every new venture still feels like that 17-year-old with 3 rolls walking down an unfamiliar street. The difference is simply this: I've learned not to wait for the discomfort to disappear before I act, because it never will. Think about that for a moment. We spend so much of our lives waiting for confidence to arrive before we begin, waiting to feel ready, waiting for certainty. But confidence doesn't create action, action creates confidence. I didn't feel like a printer until I'd been printing for years. I didn't feel like a scientist until I'd conducted hundreds of failed experiments. I didn't feel like a statesman until I'd already been representing my country abroad for a decade. You become the thing by doing the thing while still feeling like an imposter. And here's the part that might surprise you. That feeling of being an imposter, that voice that whispers, "You're not qualified, not smart enough, not ready," that voice is actually evidence that you're growing. It means you're attempting something beyond your current capabilities. It means you're expanding. The people who never feel like imposters are often the ones who've stopped challenging themselves. They've found their comfortable corner of competence, and they're staying there. There's nothing wrong with that, by the way. Security has its place. But if you want to accomplish something meaningful, if you want to leave this world different than you found it, you're going to have to get comfortable being uncomfortable. Let me tell you about my first attempts at electricity experiments. I'd read everything available, which admittedly wasn't much, but books can only take you so far. The first time I attempted to capture electrical charge in a Leyden jar, I had no idea what I was doing. I was guessing, improvising, making it up as I went along. And I failed. Repeatedly. Embarrassingly. There was one experiment where I nearly electrocuted myself. Actually shocked myself so badly that I was numb for several minutes afterward. My hands trembled. My heart raced. Any reasonable person would have stopped right there. But here's what I learned. The experiments that scared me the most were often the ones that taught me the most. I could have put that key away. I could have waited for someone else to do it, to take the risk. But innovation doesn't come from playing it safe. It comes from those moments when your hands are shaking, and you do it anyway. The rain was cold against my face. William stood beside me, holding the kite string with hands that trembled despite his best efforts to appear brave. I'd put my own son in danger. What kind of father does that? But what kind of father doesn't teach his child that some truths are worth pursuing, even when they terrify you? Then it happened. The loose threads on the string stood erect, standing straight up, like they were alive. I reached toward the key, and a spark jumped to my knuckle. Pain shot through my finger, but with it came something else entirely: proof. Absolute, undeniable proof that lightning was electricity. We weren't struck. We didn't die. But we could have. That's the thing about breakthrough moments, they often live right next to disaster. You know what's interesting? Most people remember the kite. They forget that this one experiment led to the lightning rod, which has saved countless buildings and lives over the centuries. They forget that understanding electricity transformed everything from how we communicate to how we light our homes to the device you're watching this on right now. One dangerous afternoon in a storm changed the trajectory of human progress. But here's what nobody tells you. After that day, I couldn't sleep for weeks. I kept thinking about all the ways it could have gone wrong. I kept seeing William's face in that storm, trusting me completely, and wondering if I'd been reckless or brilliant or both. That's the weight of innovation nobody discusses. It's not just about the eureka moments. It's about lying awake at night, questioning every decision, wondering if you pushed too far. It's about the responsibility that comes with being right and the devastating possibilities if you'd been wrong. But would I do it again? Absolutely. Because now we understand lightning. We can protect ourselves from it. And that's what makes wisdom different from intelligence. Intelligence as, can we do this? Wisdom asks, should we? I learned that lesson the hard way during the Constitutional Convention. There were brilliant men in that room, minds sharper than any blade. They could argue constitutional theory for hours, dissecting every nuance of governance and power. But brilliance without wisdom? That's just sophisticated foolishness. I watched young delegates construct elaborate systems of checks and balances, and yes, they were intellectually impressive. But some of them had never sat across from a man who'd lost everything, never negotiated with someone who saw the world completely differently, never had to choose between what was right and what was easy. There was one afternoon, God, I remember it clearly, we were debating representation. The arguments were getting heated. States with large populations wanted proportional representation. Smaller states wanted equal votes. Both sides had perfect logic. Both sides were absolutely convinced they were right. And they were talking past each other. Brilliant arguments, falling on deaf ears. So I stood up, took me a while. My knees weren't what they used to be, and I told them about a carpenter I once knew. This man could look at a piece of wood and see the furniture inside it. Remarkable skill, but he had this habit. He'd design these incredibly complex joints, these engineering marvels of craftsmanship. The problem was, half the time the furniture fell apart. Why? Because he was so focused on showing how clever he was, he forgot the furniture needed to actually work. He forgot that someone had to use it, live with it, depend on it. I looked around that room, and I said, gentlemen, we're not building a monument to our own cleverness. We're building a government that farmers and merchants and mothers and soldiers have to live under. Stop trying to be brilliant. Start trying to be wise. The room got very quiet. That's when we started talking about compromise. Not because compromise is intellectually satisfying, it usually isn't, but because wisdom recognizes that being right isn't the same as being helpful. I'd watched two brilliant men argue themselves into corners, both armed with flawless logic, both completely unmovable. And I'd think, this is how republics die, not from lack of good ideas, but from an excess of pride in defending them. The compromise we reached on representation, large states getting their voice in the House, small states getting equal standing in the Senate, wasn't anyone's first choice. Connecticut's delegates proposed it, and initially, almost everyone hated it. I remember thinking it was too clever by half. But here's what I've learned about compromise. It's not about finding the perfect solution. It's about finding the solution that lets everyone move forward together. When you refuse to compromise, you're essentially saying, my way is so right that I'm willing to let everything fail, rather than accept anything less. Sometimes that's noble. Often, it's just stubborn. The question isn't whether your principles are important, of course they are. The question is whether your particular application of those principles in this specific moment is so sacred that you'd sacrifice the entire project rather than adjust. And listen, I'm not talking about compromising on fundamental human rights or the core architecture of free society. Some things aren't negotiable. But I watched men nearly blow up the whole convention because they disagreed about whether the executive should have veto power or absolute veto power. The difference matters, sure, but not more than having a government at all. Here's a trick I learned. When you're in a heated negotiation, try arguing the other side's position out loud to them as convincingly as you can. Not sarcastically, genuinely. You'd be amazed at how this transforms the conversation. First, it shows you actually understand their concern, which is rarer than you'd think. Most arguments involve two people talking past each other, each convinced the other simply doesn't grasp the obvious truth. Second, it often reveals weaknesses in their position that confrontation never would. When you argue their case back to them, they sometimes hear it differently and recognize the flaws themselves. Third, it creates psychological reciprocity. Once you've genuinely represented their view, they feel obligated to do the same for yours. It's human nature. But most importantly, it forces you to confront whether you actually understand what you're arguing against or whether you're just arguing against a caricature you've created in your mind. I've watched brilliant minds demolish positions no one actually held. They'd stand there, victorious, having slayed a dragon they'd conjured themselves, while the real conversation waited patiently in the corner, untouched. There's a particular arrogance in assuming you understand someone's position better than they do. I've been guilty of it myself. You're sitting there, nodding impatiently while they speak, already formulating your devastating response, confident you know where they're heading. But here's what that arrogance costs you: the opportunity to learn something you didn't expect. Some of the most valuable insights I gained in my life came from arguments I was certain I'd win. I'd prepare my counterpoints, sharpen my rhetoric, ready myself for intellectual combat, and then the other person would say something that stopped me cold. Not because they were right about everything, but because they revealed an angle I hadn't considered, a consequence I hadn't foreseen, a human experience I hadn't lived. That only happens when you're actually listening. Really listening. Not listening for weaknesses to exploit, but listening to understand. There's a physical difference, actually. When you're listening to win, your body tenses up, your breathing becomes shallow, your mind races ahead. But when you're listening to understand, something relaxes. You become present. You become curious. And curiosity, genuine curiosity, is perhaps the most underrated tool in rational discourse. It transforms an opponent into a teacher. It turns a debate into an exploration. The moment you become genuinely curious about why someone believes what they believe, the entire dynamic shifts. I'd ask people, help me understand how you arrived at that conclusion. Walk me through your thinking. Not as a trap, not as a setup for my brilliant rebuttal, but because I actually wanted to know. And you'd be amazed how often people would, in the process of explaining their reasoning, discover the flaws themselves. They'd pause mid-sentence and say, "Wait, that doesn't quite work, does it?" That's the power of being given space to think out loud without being attacked at every turn. I learned this technique didn't just apply to grand political debates. I used it everywhere: in my printing shop when apprentices made mistakes, in the junto when discussing philosophy, even in my marriage when Deborah and I disagreed about household matters. And let me tell you, that last one might have been the most challenging arena of all. The thing is, when you stop trying to win every conversation and start trying to understand them instead, something remarkable happens to your relationships. People begin to trust you, not because you always agree with them, I certainly didn't, but because they know you're actually listening. They know that when you eventually do present a different view, it's coming from a place of genuine consideration, not reflexive opposition. I remember, one afternoon in the junto, we were discussing whether wealth was the primary measure of a person's worth to society. One member, a merchant who'd recently come into considerable fortune, was quite convinced that financial success demonstrated superior intelligence and virtue. Now, the old Benjamin, the one who loved to show off his intellectual prowess, would have immediately launched into a devastating critique of this shallow worldview. But I didn't. Instead, I asked him to tell me about his journey to success. What decisions had he made? What had he learned along the way? And as he talked, really talked, he began to mention all the people who'd helped him: the mentor who'd taught him bookkeeping, the wife who'd managed expenses during lean years, the clerk whose diligence had prevented costly errors, the community that had supported his business. By the end of his own story, he'd essentially dismantled his original argument without me saying a word against it. I suppose, he said thoughtfully, wealth measures opportunity, and good fortune as much as it measures character. That's the beautiful irony of humble inquiry. You discover that people often carry the seeds of wisdom within their own thoughts. They just need the space to let those seeds germinate, without someone trampling all over the garden trying to plant their own ideas by force. The young merchant's insight reminded me of countless conversations I'd had over the years, moments when someone stumbled upon truth, not because I'd handed it to them, but because I'd asked the right question at the right time. There's a particular magic in that moment of discovery, when you see someone's eyes light up as they articulate something they'd felt but never quite captured in words. I remember working with the Junto, our little discussion club in Philadelphia, where we'd gather weekly to debate ideas and challenge each other's thinking. I established a rule early on. No man could directly contradict another. Instead, if you disagreed, you had to ask a question that revealed the flaw in the reasoning. Might there perhaps be another way to consider this matter? Or, what would happen if we applied that principle to a different situation? At first, some of the members found this constraint frustrating. They wanted to declare their superior wisdom, to win arguments with decisive rhetorical blows. But gradually, something remarkable happened. The quality of our conversations deepened. People actually changed their minds not because they'd been defeated in debate, but because they'd been invited to think more carefully about their own positions. I saw grown men, successful in their trades and professions, discover gaps in their own reasoning they'd never noticed before. And here's the crucial part. They didn't resent these discoveries. They welcomed them. Because when you find your own flaw through gentle questioning, it feels like progress, like learning. When someone else points out your flaw with certainty and force, it feels like humiliation. This principle became foundational to everything I did, whether negotiating treaties, proposing public projects, or simply trying to convince a neighbor to join a subscription library. I learned to present my ideas as questions, my proposals as possibilities worth exploring together. Would it not be beneficial if we had a way to protect our homes from fire? I'd ask, rather than lecturing about the necessity of a fire company. I've been pondering whether there might be some merit in collecting books together, where all could access them. What do you think of such a notion? This method transformed not only how people received my ideas but how I generated them in the first place. When you approach a problem as a question rather than a statement, you invite others to think alongside you. You create collaborators instead of critics. I cannot count the number of times someone I asked for guidance ended up championing an idea as their own, and I was perfectly content with that arrangement. The fire company, the library, the hospital, the university, all bore the fingerprints of many hands, and all succeeded precisely because no single person could claim exclusive ownership. The art of influence, I discovered, lies not in the strength of your voice but in the quality of your listening. Every person you meet knows something you do not. The printer knows his press, the sailor knows his winds, the farmer knows his soil. If you can make them feel heard, truly heard, they will teach you the world. I made it a practice to ask genuine questions of everyone I encountered. Not the polite inquiries we make merely to seem interested, but real questions born of curiosity. What challenges did they face? What solutions had they attempted? What kept them awake at night? From these conversations came insights no book could have taught me. A casual remark from a ship captain about the varying speeds of his Atlantic crossings led me to chart the Gulf Stream. A glassmaker's complaint about wasted material inspired thoughts on efficiency that I applied to everything from stove design to governance. The world is full of teachers, if you are willing to be a student. But here is the delicate balance. While you must be genuinely humble, you cannot be genuinely weak. There is a difference between modesty and self-erasure. I never pretended to be less intelligent than I was. I simply stopped needing to prove it at every opportunity. I worked harder than most, read more widely, thought more deeply, but I let my results speak rather than my boasts. When Poor Richard's Almanac became the best-selling publication in the colonies, I did not need to tell people I was a successful writer. When my electrical experiments drew attention from the Royal Society, I did not need to announce myself as a scientist. The world did that for me. And the beauty of this approach, when others praised me, their words carried infinitely more weight than my own ever could. This is the paradox most people fail to grasp. True recognition comes not from self-proclamation, but from the voluntary testimony of others. When you declare your own greatness, skepticism follows. When others declare it for you, belief spreads like wildfire. I cultivated this dynamic deliberately through what I called useful projects. Every initiative, I launched the lending library, the fire company, the hospital, the university, I presented not as monuments to Benjamin Franklin, but as community improvements that required collective action. I positioned myself as merely the organizer, the facilitator, never the hero. When the library company succeeded, prominent citizens thanked me publicly. When the Union Fire Company prevented catastrophes, grateful homeowners spread my name. I never asked for these accolades. I simply created conditions where my contributions became undeniable, and the community felt compelled to acknowledge them. This strategy served me especially well in politics, where naked ambition breeds enemies faster than smallpox spreads. I watched countless talented men destroy their careers by grasping too obviously for power. They schemed, they maneuvered, they announced their qualifications at every opportunity, and they made themselves insufferable. I took the opposite path. When I wanted influence in the Pennsylvania Assembly, I did not campaign loudly or make grand promises. Instead, I made myself indispensable through competent service. I arrived early, stayed late, mastered every procedural detail, and helped others succeed in their initiatives. I became the person they could not imagine governing without. The positions followed naturally: Clerk of the Assembly, Postmaster of Philadelphia, Deputy Postmaster General of the Colonies, Representative to London. Each role came not because I demanded it, but because those in power concluded I was the obvious choice. This is how you build a reputation that lasts. Make yourself so genuinely valuable that others cannot help but elevate you. But here's the paradox that most ambitious people miss. The more you chase recognition, the more it eludes you. The more you make yourself genuinely useful, the more recognition you find. I never wrote Poor Richard's Almanac thinking, "This will make me famous." I wrote it because people needed practical wisdom they could afford. I never started the lending library to build my reputation. I did it because Philadelphia needed books, and most couldn't afford their own collections. The fame was a byproduct, not the goal. This is the difference between manipulation and genuine value creation. The manipulator asks, "How can I appear important?" The value creator asks, "How can I solve a problem that matters?" One leads to temporary illusions. The other builds monuments that outlast your lifetime. Consider this carefully. What are you known for right now? If people were asked to describe your contribution in one sentence, what would they say? If the answer is unclear or unflattering, you have work to do. And that work is not about managing perceptions, it's about changing reality. I invested years becoming the best printer in Philadelphia. Not through boasting, but through delivering superior work, meeting deadlines others missed, taking on difficult projects others refused. When the government needed official documents printed, they came to me. When the post needed efficiency, they appointed me postmaster. My reputation was built on a foundation of undeniable competence. But competence alone isn't enough. You must also make your competence visible. This is not about arrogance, it's about communication. I wrote constantly. I published my ideas. I engaged in public debates. I made my thinking transparent so others could evaluate its merit. Many capable people fail because they hide their light under a bushel, waiting to be discovered. The world is too busy for that. You must signal your value clearly, but through substance, not empty noise. Here's a practical framework. Document your work. Share your process. Teach what you learn. When I conducted my electrical experiments, I didn't hoard the findings. I wrote detailed letters to the Royal Society. I explained my methods. I invited others to replicate my results. This transparency didn't diminish my reputation, it enhanced it, because it demonstrated confidence and a genuine scientific spirit. And here's what happened next. When I shared my findings openly, others began to build upon them. Scientists across Europe and America refined my experiments, tested my theories, and challenged my conclusions. Some proved me right. Others found exceptions or improvements. This is exactly how knowledge should advance, not locked away in secrecy, but spread freely so humanity can benefit. I published my electrical observations in plain language that tradesmen and scholars alike could understand. No cryptic symbols. No deliberately obscure terminology designed to exclude. Knowledge hoarded is knowledge wasted. What good is understanding if it serves only to elevate one person while the world remains in darkness? The same principle applied to my inventions. The Franklin stove, I could have patented it, made a fortune from exclusive rights. The governor of Pennsylvania himself urged me to do so. But I refused. In my autobiography, I wrote that, as we enjoy great advantages from the inventions of others, we should be glad of an opportunity to serve others by any invention of ours, and this we should do freely and generously. That stove warmed thousands of homes more efficiently than traditional fireplaces. It saved wood, reduced smoke, and made winter more bearable for families of modest means. Had I monopolized it for profit, its adoption would have been slower, more limited. My satisfaction came not from royalties, but from seeing the genuine improvement in people's lives. The same with bifocals, another invention I freely shared. I could have enriched myself considerably, but what mattered more? My bank account, or the ability of aging scholars, craftsmen, and readers everywhere to see both near and far without constantly switching spectacles? This approach to knowledge and invention created something unexpected, a reputation that opened doors no amount of money could have purchased. When I arrived in France as an ambassador, I was received not merely as a diplomat, but as a philosopher and scientist whose openness and generosity had already crossed the ocean ahead of me. The French intellectuals embraced me not because I was wealthy or titled, but because I represented the democratic spirit of knowledge, the idea that wisdom belongs to humanity, not to aristocracy. My willingness to share freely had built cultural capital that proved invaluable in securing French support for American independence. This diplomatic triumph was not an accident of personality, it was the predictable result of decades spent investing in relationships rather than hoarding advantages. While other colonial representatives struggled to gain audiences with French ministers, I dined with Voltaire, corresponded with the royal court, and found that doors opened not through protocol but through genuine connection. The lightning rod experiments that I had published freely years earlier became conversation starters that led to conversations about liberty, which led to military alliances. My scientific generosity had become geopolitical currency. And here lies a truth that confounds the transactional mind. The returns on generosity compound in ways that cannot be predicted or controlled, which is precisely why they are so powerful. When you share knowledge freely, you cannot know whether it will come back to you as friendship, opportunity, influence, or inspiration. You only know that you have set something valuable in motion in the world, and that the world tends to reward those who enrich it. Consider the man who patents an invention and restricts its use compared to one who publishes the principle freely. The first may profit substantially in the near term, but the second enables 1,000 improvements, creates a community of innovators who see him as a benefactor rather than a competitor, and often finds that derivative innovations open more doors than the original patent ever could. I chose the second path, not out of naivete about human nature, but out of sophistication about it, understanding that human beings are more inclined to collaborate with those who have already demonstrated good faith. This approach also protected me from a particularly insidious form of poverty, the poverty of living in fear. Those who hoard their advantages live in constant anxiety that others will discover their secrets, replicate their methods, or surpass their achievements. They must guard their knowledge jealously, which means they cannot discuss it openly, cannot benefit from others' perspectives, and cannot experience the joy of teaching. They have wealth, perhaps, but they live as misers of the mind, and that is an impoverished existence regardless of one's bank balance. I, by contrast, could speak freely about my discoveries, knowing that doing so diminished nothing I possessed. In fact, each conversation about electricity or economics or governance deepened my own understanding, as explaining ideas to others forces clarification and often reveals gaps in one's own thinking. This is why I always encouraged young printers and tradesmen who came to me for advice. When I helped James Parker establish his printing business in New York, or when I shared the techniques I had developed with David Hall before making him my partner, I was not creating competitors. I was building a network of capability that would ultimately benefit everyone, myself included. Parker's success meant better distribution for ideas, which meant a more informed public, which meant better customers for all of us engaged in the information trade. Hall's competence meant I could trust my business during my absences, which freed me to pursue diplomatic work that brought far greater rewards than any printing contract. The frightened man cannot see these connections. He views every interaction as a zero-sum transaction where he must extract maximum value while giving minimum in return. This approach might work for a single deal, but it destroys the possibility of ongoing relationships. I built my fortune not through clever one-time schemes, but through decades of mutually beneficial arrangements with people who trusted me because I had consistently demonstrated that dealing with me left them better off. Consider my approach to patents and intellectual property. When I invented the Franklin stove, which provided far more heat with far less fuel than traditional fireplaces, I was advised to secure a patent that would have made me considerably wealthy. The governor of Pennsylvania himself offered me a patent that would have given me exclusive rights to manufacture and sell this innovation. I declined. My reasoning was simple. I had benefited greatly from the inventions of others throughout my life, everything from the printing press to the scientific instruments I used in my experiments. How could I, in good conscience, withhold an invention that could warm homes and save fuel from those who might improve upon it or adapt it for their needs? The decision proved remarkably fruitful, though not in ways immediately obvious. The stove spread rapidly throughout the colonies and beyond, becoming known everywhere as the Franklin stove, which association with practical innovation that served my reputation far better than the modest patent fees would have served my purse. More importantly, it established me as someone who placed public benefit above private profit, a reputation that opened doors throughout Europe when I later served as a diplomat. Kings and philosophers alike received me warmly, in part because I was known as that rare thing, a successful man who was not grasping. The French court particularly delighted in this aspect of my reputation. When I arrived in Paris in 1776 to seek alliance during our revolution, I found that my scientific reputation had preceded me most advantageously. Ladies wore their hair à la Franklin. Medallions bearing my likeness appeared in fashionable shops. The philosophers invited me to their salons, where I was received not as a petitioner from rebellious colonies, but as a celebrated homme de science who happened also to be conducting diplomatic business. This social capital proved invaluable. While other diplomats relied solely on formal negotiations and treaty language, I cultivated relationships at dinner parties and salons. I played chess with brilliant minds, discussed science with the académie, and charmed the influential women who shaped opinion in Parisian society. The goodwill I had generated through years of sharing my discoveries freely has now translated into political capital when my young nation needed it most. The contrast with my British counterparts was instructive. They negotiated from positions of military power and economic leverage, presenting demands and conditions. I negotiated from a position of intellectual respect and personal affection. When the French finally committed to our cause, it was not merely a strategic calculation, though strategy certainly played its part, but also because they had come to care about the success of this peculiar American, who embodied their Enlightenment ideals. This brings me to perhaps the most counterintuitive principle about reputation and success. Your greatest leverage often comes from what you give away freely. The electrical knowledge, the stove design, the countless civic improvements I championed in Philadelphia. None of these enriched me directly. Yet, together, they built a form of wealth more valuable than any patent monopoly: the trust and esteem of worthy people. The paradox confounds those who think in purely transactional terms. They see generosity as loss, sharing as diminishment. But influence operates by different mathematics. When I published Poor Richard's Almanac, I could have hoarded the wisdom, charged premium prices, and created artificial scarcity. Instead, I made it affordable to every farmer and tradesman in the colonies. The result? My ideas spread like seeds on the wind, taking root in minds I would never meet, in towns I would never visit. Each person who quoted Poor Richard became an advocate for my way of thinking. Each household that hung my almanac on their wall kept my name before them throughout the year. I sacrificed immediate profit for something far more valuable. I became part of the common vocabulary, woven into the fabric of colonial thought. This is the power of strategic generosity, not indiscriminate giving, but calculated investment in reputation. When I established the lending library in Philadelphia, I didn't charge exorbitant fees. I made knowledge accessible. The library didn't make me wealthy in coin, but it made me indispensable to the intellectual life of the city. When those library members rose to positions of influence, whose counsel do you think they sought? Whose judgment did they trust? Consider your own sphere carefully. What knowledge do you possess that others desperately need? What skills have you mastered that could elevate those around you? The instinct is to clutch these advantages close, to meter them out only for immediate payment. But this is the thinking of the small merchant, not the architect of influence. I'm not suggesting you work without compensation or squander your expertise on the ungrateful. Rather, identify the strategic gifts that position you as a source of value. Share insights that demonstrate your depth without exhausting your reserves. Solve problems publicly that showcase your capabilities. Let your generosity be visible enough to build a reputation, but selective enough to maintain your standing. The finest reputation builders understand that every act of public service is also an act of self-interest, rightly understood. When I organized Philadelphia's first fire company, I wasn't being purely altruistic. A city that doesn't burn to the ground is better for everyone, including those with property to protect. But notice what else happened. I became known as someone who solved community problems. When larger challenges arose, whose leadership seemed natural, the leader who had already earned trust through smaller victories. This pattern repeated throughout my life. The lending library didn't just give people books, it positioned me as someone invested in public enlightenment. The University of Pennsylvania didn't just educate young minds, it made me a champion of accessible knowledge. Each institution I created was a genuine service and a strategic asset that expanded my influence while appearing entirely altruistic. Here's what makes this approach so powerful. It's completely authentic. I genuinely wanted Philadelphia to have better fire protection, better education, and better lighting. The strategic benefit didn't diminish the real value. In fact, the authenticity is what made the strategy work. People can smell calculated manipulation a mile away, but they flock towards someone whose self-interest happens to align with community benefit. Think about modern parallels. Someone who organizes neighborhood cleanups isn't just picking up trash, they're becoming known as someone who gets things done. A person who starts a professional meetup group isn't just networking. They're positioning themselves as a connector and leader in their field. The community benefit is real. The personal advantage is equally real. There's no contradiction. I applied this same principle to international diplomacy with devastating effectiveness. When France was deciding whether to support American independence, I didn't simply make arguments or offer bribes. Instead, I became a cultural phenomenon in Paris. I wore simple clothes that made me seem like a noble frontiersman. I attended salons and scientific societies. I became celebrated as a symbol of American virtue and Enlightenment values. Was I manipulating French public opinion? Absolutely. Was I genuinely the person they admired? Mostly, yes. The performance amplified qualities that actually existed. French public enthusiasm for the American cause made it politically difficult for their government to refuse support. I created conditions where helping America served French interests and satisfied French public sentiment. The Treaty of Alliance we secured in 1778 changed everything. France committed its navy, its treasury, and its soldiers. But even after that formal commitment, I understood my role hadn't ended, it had merely shifted. Treaties are signed by governments, but sustained by relationships and continued perception management. I maintained my visibility, my accessibility, my symbolic value. Every French officer heading to America wanted to meet me first. Every letter from Congress, complaining about French delays or conditions, required careful translation not just of language, but of cultural context and diplomatic necessity. The young Marquis de Lafayette became a living bridge between our nations, and I cultivated that relationship carefully. His idealism served our cause, but so did my grounding influence on his expectations. When he grew frustrated with Congress or battlefield setbacks, I reminded him of the larger picture. When French officials questioned his American adventures, I vouched for the strategic value of his personal commitment. Here's what most people miss about diplomacy. It's not just about big moments and formal signatures. It's about the 1,000 small interactions that build or erode trust. It's the dinner conversation where you diffuse a misunderstanding before it reaches official channels. It's the well-timed joke that breaks the tension in a negotiation. It's remembering someone's birthday, their children's names, and their personal interests. I attended salons where ideas shaped policy before it reached the king's ministers. I cultivated journalists and publishers who influenced public opinion. I befriended bankers whose financial confidence in American credit proved as valuable as their actual loans. I built a network of influence that operated on multiple levels simultaneously. And I never stopped being myself. Some diplomats try to become whoever their audience wants them to be. That's exhausting and ultimately transparent. I was authentically Franklin, the parts of Franklin that served our purpose. The difference is subtle but critical. I wasn't lying about who I was. I was selective about which aspects I emphasized. My Parisian persona was genuinely me, just not all of me. The serious negotiator who could calculate terms down to the last decimal existed alongside the charming dinner guest. The strategic thinker coexisted with the man who genuinely enjoyed French culture and company. This integration of self was perhaps my greatest diplomatic tool, one that couldn't be taught or replicated. A pure performance would have eventually cracked under the pressure of those years in France. Complete transparency would have undermined necessary negotiations. What worked was being authentically myself while strategically choosing which aspects to emphasize in different contexts. The French appreciated this, I think. They're sophisticated enough to understand that all social interaction involves some degree of performance. What they couldn't tolerate was insincerity or condescension. My genuine affection for French culture, my real intellectual curiosity, my authentic enjoyment of their company, these weren't strategic choices. They were simply true. The strategy lay in recognizing how these authentic qualities could serve diplomatic purposes. Consider how I handled the sensitive matter of French military support. This required a delicate balance. We desperately needed their ships and soldiers, but appearing desperate would weaken our negotiating position. I had to convey both the justice of our cause and the pragmatic benefits to France of supporting us, all while maintaining the dignity appropriate to representing a sovereign nation. In formal meetings, I presented detailed military assessments, economic projections, and strategic analyses. But around dinner tables, I told stories about ordinary Americans standing up to tyranny, about farmers becoming soldiers, about the spirit of a people determined to be free. These stories weren't propaganda. They were my genuine observations, but I chose to share them in contexts where they would have maximum emotional impact. The night after news reached Paris of our victory at Saratoga, I attended a salon where the talk naturally turned to the American war. I didn't boast or gloat. Instead, I spoke quietly about the farmers and merchants who had stood against professional soldiers, about the courage required when facing an empire. My voice caught genuinely when describing the sacrifices made. The room fell silent. Within weeks, France had committed to a formal alliance. Had that emotion been manufactured for effect? No. Had I chosen that particular evening, that particular audience, to express it? Absolutely. I learned to choose my battles not by their nobility, but by their winnability, not by their moral weight, but by their practical outcome. There's a profound difference between being principled and being effective, and I was always more interested in the latter. Take the Constitutional Convention. I sat there, summer after summer, watching young men preach absolute positions. No compromise on representation, no compromise on sovereignty, no compromise on the structure of the Senate. Every hill is a place to die. I waited. I listened. And when the moment came when tempers had flared and positions had hardened, I suggested we open each session with prayer. Not because I was particularly devout, mind you, but because nothing deflates absolutism quite like acknowledging a power greater than one's own opinion. It worked. Not because God intervened, but because the very act of pausing, of humbling ourselves collectively, created space for negotiation. This is what I mean by choosing when to speak. It's not about finding the perfect moment to deliver your truth. It's about engineering the conditions under which your truth can actually take root. I wrote under pseudonyms for years. Silence Dogood, Richard Saunders, dozens of others. Why? Because sometimes the message is more powerful when it's divorced from the messenger. Sometimes people need to hear an idea without the baggage of who's saying it. That's strategic silence. That's choosing not just when to speak, but how, and through whom, and in what voice. And here's what no one tells you about this approach. It requires you to swallow your ego constantly, to watch others take credit for ideas you planted, to see your words attributed to someone else and smile graciously, to know that history might never record your specific contribution to a particular moment. Can you do that? Can you care more about the outcome than the attribution? Most people can't. Their need for recognition overwhelms their commitment to the cause. They'd rather be publicly right and ultimately ineffective than anonymously influential and genuinely impactful. I chose differently. Not because I'm noble, we've established I'm not, but because I understood something fundamental about how change actually happens. It happens in whispers before it happens in shouts. It happens in private conversations before it happens in public declarations. It happens in strategic retreats before it happens in triumphant advances. The greatest leaders understand that transformation doesn't announce itself with trumpets. It tiptoes in wearing the costume of compromise, whispers its intentions in the language of pragmatism, and only reveals its true face once the old order has already surrendered its defenses. I watched this principle play out in Philadelphia when we debated representation in Congress. The small states threatened to walk away entirely. The large states refused to yield their proportional advantage. Both sides postured publicly about principles, while privately calculating acceptable losses. The Connecticut Compromise didn't emerge from either side winning the argument. It emerged from both sides, accepting that half a loaf was infinitely preferable to starvation. The Senate would satisfy the small states' demand for an equal voice. The House would satisfy the large states' claim to proportional power. Neither side got what they originally wanted, yet both sides got something sustainable. This wasn't weakness, it was the highest form of strategic thinking. Because the alternative to compromise wasn't victory for one side, it was dissolution for everyone. The alternative wasn't a purer principle being upheld, it was no union at all, and therefore no platform upon which any principles could stand. Your generation faces similar calculations constantly. In your workplaces, in your relationships, in your civic engagement, you're asked daily whether you'll hold out for the perfect or accept the achievable. Whether you'll die on every hill or save your strength for the battles that truly matter. The wisdom isn't in always compromising. Some principles are genuinely non-negotiable. The wisdom is in knowing which battles are existential and which are merely preferential. Which surrenders represent strategic repositioning, and which represent catastrophic collapse. I learned this through painful experience. Early in my printing career, I wanted every article to reflect my exact opinions, every publication to showcase my personal genius. I lost partnerships, alienated clients, and limited my influence to the tiny circle of people who already agreed with me completely. Only when I learned to subordinate my ego to my objectives did my influence begin to expand. Only when I made space for other voices did my own voice carry further. The paradox haunts every would-be persuader. The harder you push, the more resistance you create. The louder you proclaim your rightness, the more defensive others become. I've watched brilliant minds lose winnable arguments simply because they couldn't resist the sweetness of humiliating their opponent. They won the battle of words and lost the war of influence. True persuasion requires something most people find almost unbearable: patience with imperfection. You must allow others to arrive at conclusions on their own timeline, through their own reasoning process, even when you could shortcut the journey with a devastating logical flourish. You must let them save face, even when you could expose their inconsistency. You must give credit generously, even when you provided the crucial insight. This isn't a weakness. It's strategic wisdom earned through countless failures. I remember negotiating with the British ministry before the revolution became inevitable. Every instinct screamed to lecture them about their short-sightedness, to catalogue their failures, to predict their downfall with satisfying precision. And had I indulged those instincts, I would have felt righteously vindicated but accomplished absolutely nothing. Instead, I posed questions. I expressed genuine curiosity about their perspective. I validated the parts of their reasoning that contained truth, which made them more receptive when I gently illuminated the flaws in their logic. Did they always see reason? Of course not. Human stubbornness runs deeper than the Schuylkill River. But I created far more openings for dialogue than I would have through confrontation. I preserved relationships that proved valuable when circumstances shifted. I earned a reputation as someone worth listening to, rather than someone to avoid. The ego wants immediate validation. Strategy requires delayed gratification. The ego demands visible credit. Strategy often works best invisibly. The ego seeks to prove superiority. Strategy seeks to achieve objectives, whether you get recognition or not. Ask yourself honestly, do you want to feel smart, or do you want to change minds? Do you want to win arguments, or do you want to win outcomes? Do you want the satisfaction of being proven right, or the power of actually shaping reality? Because you cannot reliably have both. Not in this world of proud, defensive, ego-driven human beings who will reject even beneficial ideas if accepting them means admitting they were wrong. The most successful people I've observed, and I've observed kings, merchants, inventors, And statesmen across decades understand this fundamental truth. You can win arguments, or you can win allies. Rarely both, simultaneously. I learned this myself during the Constitutional Convention. There were moments when I knew, with absolute certainty, that my position was correct. I had the facts, the logic, the historical precedents. I could have demolished my opponent's arguments publicly, humiliated them with superior reasoning, and I would have lost everything that mattered. Instead, I waited. I spoke privately. I credited others with ideas that originated elsewhere. I allowed proud men to save face while still moving toward necessary compromises. Was it satisfying to my ego? Not remotely. Was it effective? We created a government that has endured centuries. You see this principle violated constantly in modern discourse. Someone presents a flawed argument. You know exactly how to dismantle it. The words are forming in your mind, sharp and devastating. You can already imagine their face when you deliver the perfect counterpoint. And if you do, if you indulge that satisfying impulse, you will win the argument and lose the person. They will never forgive you for the public humiliation. They will never adopt your position, no matter how correct it is. They will spend years finding ways to oppose you, consciously or unconsciously, simply because you made them feel small. This is the tragic arithmetic of human psychology. The momentary pleasure of intellectual victory costs you years of potential collaboration, influence, and progress. So here's what the truly wise do. They help others arrive at better conclusions, while believing it was their own journey. They plant seeds rather than forcing harvests. They ask questions that guide thinking rather than delivering pronouncements that trigger defenses. Have you considered what might happen if yields better results than you're wrong because? I'm curious about your thoughts on this alternative. Works better than? The obvious answer is, what would convince you otherwise? Opens doors that, here's why you're mistaken, slams shut forever. This isn't a weakness. This is strategic brilliance. You're accomplishing your actual goal, changing minds, improving outcomes, advancing ideas rather than the false goal of being publicly acknowledged as correct. Let me tell you what I've observed about the people who change the world. They rarely do it with their names attached to the initial idea. They do it by moving through rooms and conversations like water through a landscape, finding the path of least resistance, filling spaces where they're welcomed, gently shaping the terrain through patient persistence. I've watched brilliant innovations die because their creators demanded recognition before implementation. And I've watched modest suggestions reshape entire industries because their advocates cared more about outcomes than authorship. You know what's fascinating? The most successful idea spreaders I've known all shared one peculiar habit. They collected other people's successes the way some collect coins. They took genuine delight in watching someone else implement a version of their suggestion and claim it as their own breakthrough. They understood something profound. An idea implemented under someone else's banner still changes the world the same amount. Think about the last time you successfully influenced someone's thinking. I'd wager it wasn't when you cornered them with irrefutable logic and demanded they acknowledge your superior reasoning. It was probably when you asked a question that led them to discover the conclusion themselves, or when you shared information casually that they later used to make a better decision. This is the paradox that separates the effective from the frustrated. The moment you surrender your need to be visibly right is the moment you become maximally influential. You stop wasting energy on the performance of correctness and invest it entirely in the transmission of better thinking. I've applied this principle everywhere, from diplomatic negotiations where letting others take credit preserved alliances, to scientific collaborations where shared attribution multiplied resources. The question was never, will they acknowledge my contribution? It was always, will this advance the work? And here's what happens when you operate this way consistently. People begin to trust you in ways they don't trust the credit seekers. They share information more freely. They invite you into earlier conversations. They implement your suggestions more readily because they don't fear you'll weaponize their adoption of your ideas. You become what I call a thought catalyst, someone whose presence makes better thinking happen without requiring the reaction to be attributed to you specifically. The transformation is subtle but unmistakable. People begin seeking your counsel not because you have authority over them, but because thinking with you produces better results than thinking alone. They trust you with half-formed ideas because you've proven you won't mock the chrysalis while demanding to see the butterfly. I witnessed this dynamic most clearly in the daily rhythm of our printing house. The skilled compositors who set type, knew far more about the craft's subtleties than I did, but they began bringing me layout dilemmas not because I could set type better, but because I asked questions that helped them see their own solutions more clearly. What if we tried it this way? I'd offer tentatively, framing my suggestion as exploration rather than directive. More often than not, they'd improve upon my suggestion immediately, yes, and if we do that, we could also. Building on the foundation without feeling I'd imposed it. This is the paradox of intellectual humility. The less you insist on being right, the more often you actually are. Because you're not wasting cognitive energy defending positions, you're not filtering information through the question, does this support what I already believe? Instead, you're genuinely asking, what's actually true here? The business implications of this mindset are considerable. Markets punish stubborn certainty and reward adaptive thinking. The merchant who insists he knows what customers want, despite evidence to the contrary, loses ground to the merchant who asks, "What am I missing?" and genuinely listens to the answer. I've seen entire enterprises flourish or founder based on whether the person at the helm could say, "I don't know," without shame. The ability to admit uncertainty doesn't signal weakness, it signals you're still gathering data, still refining your model of reality, still learning. It signals you're more committed to finding truth than to being seen as its sole proprietor. And here's something I discovered that might surprise you. The people who most readily admit what they don't know often end up knowing the most. It's counterintuitive until you think about it. When you acknowledge a gap in your knowledge, you create space for that gap to be filled. When you pretend the gap doesn't exist, you cement your ignorance in place. I kept what I called an ignorance journal for many years, a small book where I'd write down things I realized I didn't understand, questions that stumped me, phenomena I couldn't explain, assumptions I'd made that turned out to be wrong. That journal was one of my most valuable possessions, more precious than any ledger of accounts. It was a map of where my thinking needed to grow. Some entries stayed in that journal for years before I found answers. Others I never fully resolved. But the act of acknowledging what I didn't know, of making my ignorance explicit, rather than letting it remain a vague, unexamined fog, that act alone made me sharper, more curious, more alive to learning. The people I worried about weren't those with long ignorance journals. They were those who claimed to have none, those who met every question with immediate certainty, those who never paused, never reconsidered, never said, "Wait, let me think about that differently." Because here's the truth we need to face. The world is far more complex than any single person can fully comprehend. The variables are too numerous, the systems too interconnected, the feedback loops too subtle. Anyone who claims to have it all figured out is either lying to you or lying to themselves, usually both. The wisest people I've known, the ones whose counsel I sought in moments of genuine confusion, were those who could hold multiple contradictory ideas in their minds simultaneously, testing them against each other, looking for synthesis rather than simple answers. They understood that most profound questions don't have a single correct response. They have better and worse ways of thinking about them. This is intellectual maturity. Recognizing that certainty is often the booby prize we give ourselves for stopping the hard work of thinking. Real wisdom lives in the questions we continue asking, the assumptions we continue challenging, the beliefs we hold lightly enough to revise when better evidence appears.